The title of my message today is For Thy Father's Sake. It recalls one of the great passages of Scripture in the Old Testament there in 2 Samuel. We'll talk about it in just a minute, but I can't help but think about Father's Day and how wonderful it is to be a father and how unready I was for it. I kept thinking about that this week. I remembered an old story, but I really like it, about the little boy who went into the kitchen and said to his mother, "Where'd I come from?" Now, of course, you always hate to see that day come, because maybe you think, well, maybe I should have already told them, or maybe they're not old enough, and so she decided to go with the family lie. She said, "The stork brought you." He looked a little dismayed and went into the living room. He said, "Grandma, I saw her. Where did I come from?" And she said, "Well, just like your mom and I, the stork brought you." He put his hands on his hips and said, "You mean to tell me there hadn't been a natural birth in this family in 3 generations?" Birth is a wonderful thing. How many of you remember how terrified you were the night before you got married? Let's see your hand, just a couple. I thought it'd be more men than that, really, because, if there was ever a time to doubt, to wonder if you're really in love and am I doing the right thing? But for a man to become a husband and then later a father is a tremendous thing, because you realize what a privilege it is, first of all. Just looking around the auditorium, it's very obvious. Most of you men married way over your head, punching way above your weight class. But the truth, I got a couple amens from women. That was good. A couple of women said, "Amen, preacher." That's right. Yeah, he's lucky to have me. But I think that it's kind of a wonderful thing when you realize that as a man, and I'm not sure it's like this anymore, because everything's a partnership, and you go through. But when I got married, you were not just getting married. You're not just getting a wife. You were shouldering a tremendous responsibility. And I remember thinking about Jill and thinking, I got to take care of her the rest of my life. Really, I am to be her partner. I have to be supportive of her, and more than anything else, Lord, I got to feed her. I got to give her a place to live. And for a man, that's a heavy deal. Now, I know it's not like that anymore, but it was when I got married. Now, but you go ahead and get married, and it becomes a wonderful experience, and you mean to sit down and talk about having children. Jill and I talked about having children. Do you remember this, honey? And I said, well, she said, "How many children do you want to have?" It's the truth. I said, "Oh, I don't know, football team. Let's have our own football team." She said, "Let's talk about basketball first." But I think most of all, we had in our mind, I'm not ready to have any children. Not right away. But a week or two after we got back from our honeymoon, we had Janice. So right away, it almost seemed like Janice, our first daughter, came with her. I don't hardly remember that 9 months in between. But and boy, you talk about getting married and having butterflies. You fathers you can tell me later if you want to, but the truth is, as traumatic as it is for a woman to have a child, we don't get nearly enough credit. I mean, especially the first. And you're just so concerned. If you're like me, you have absolutely no idea what's going on. And I'll be honest with you, I'm glad we had our children back in the 60s and 70s, because you didn't have to go in back then. I don't know if I could go in. I'll be honest with you. There are some things that I am content with being a mystery for the rest of my life. I'm not sure I want to see anyone compromised in that particular way, and I'll be perfectly happy. Nowadays, I remember when my son-in-law went in with Janice, and he said, "Well, I'll come in and watch this," and he went, boom, hit the floor just like a dead fish, And so I was out there in the waiting room reading 2-year-old Sports Illustrated, waiting for it to happen, and thoughts going through my mind. I don't know. Is it too late to call this off? And another mouth to feed. Another one that I'm responsible. I gotta buy food. I gotta buy clothes. I gotta put them through school and all the drama and boy, in your mind you're thinking, I know one thing for sure. I am not ready. Guess what? Nobody is ever really ready. I don't care how ready you think you are, you're not ready. So I heard Janice cry. I went in next to the bed, and there was Jill holding Janice in her arms. And I looked down at that little red-faced bundle, and she was so tiny. And I remember looking at her hands, and her hand was just about as big as my thumb. And all the doubts in my mind almost immediately went away when she wrapped that little tiny hand around my finger for the first time. Her little hands, they're still little by the way, her little hands meant a lot to me through the years. I remember walking out to the bus stop with her on her first day of school. Now, Janice, as you can imagine, like her mother and father, she's vertically challenged. She was really tiny. The bus pulled up in front of our house, and Janice went out, and the running board where she was supposed to get on the bus hit her just about here. And so I was going to help her, and she looked at me and gave me a look that she still gives me quite often now, like, don't touch me. Okay, so she threw her lunch box on the first step. You know how big that is. And she threw her arms up on there and threw that little tiny leg and rolled over in her new dress on that dirty bus and stood up and was so proud of herself as she picked up her lunchbox and went on the bus. I am standing there, and I would say, don't let her cry. Don't let her see you cry. Don't let her see you cry, whatever you do. But you're kind of choked up anyhow. And then through the years of growing up, those special times when talking with Mom won't do, but just a reassurance of Dad looking you in the face and saying, you're the most beautiful girl in the world. Seemed very essential for a good, strong woman to grow from that little tiny child. I remember taking her hand. I walked her down the aisle, and I also then performed the marriage ceremony. But I remember standing at the back and saying to her, it's not too late. You can change your mind. Here are the keys of the car. I was ready to do anything, and she just patted me and said, Dad, it's okay. And I took her down the aisle, and Doug was down there waiting on her. And I remember taking that little hand and placing it in the hand of my future son-in-law. Not easy to do. I'll never forget how it felt when she kissed me goodbye. When things would never really, I thought, be the same. I don't know how old some of you are, but I hope you have seen, it will take time to see some of the old movies that actually had a moral to them. There's a movie with Spencer Tracy, that's how old it is, and most people are going, who? Spencer Tracy was a great actor, and the movie was called The Father of the Bride. It kind of rehearsed almost in detail the way most fathers feel. He was willing to give up everything, sell the house if necessary, to make this wedding day the best day in her life. And it cost him a fortune, but he was a good sport. He continually paid out, and also he sat without saying anything, which was uncharacteristic, and was very patient through all the rehearsals and meeting the new in-laws. That's always just the joy. But he went through all of that, and then he gave her away. There was a quick scattering after this reception. The crowds were so great, and he was always crowded out and somehow couldn't get next to his daughter. They were getting ready to line up for all the pictures. You know how they do. And they were lined up there across the front, but the crowd was so big that in his backyard that he couldn't get up there, and so he was in none of the pictures. He thought, well, that's all right. She looked so happy. And the next time he sees her, she's being showered with rice and thrown in the back of a car with this new guy, and they take off for their honeymoon. He comes in the house. I'm telling you, he's a great actor. He comes in the house, and he looks suicidal. He looks so depressed. He didn't even get to tell her goodbye or kiss her goodbye. And he just feels like it just wasn't worth it. I have lost, he says to his wife, my daughter. And then the phone rings. Oh, Daddy, she says, we're at the train station. We're getting ready to leave. But I want to thank you for the best day of my life. And you're the most wonderful daddy in the whole world. And I wish I could kiss you 100 times. I'll call you when we get back. He hangs up the phone and he smiles through his tears and says, I feel like dancing. I haven't lost her at all. I still have my little girl. That's what it's kind of like to be a father. The Bible has a lot to say about being a father. There's some of the most beautiful passages in the Bible, and it has to do with fatherhood. I want us to go back. I don't know if I'll have time for 2, 3, 4, or 5. Knowing me, let's try 1. But let's talk a little bit this morning about 2 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 7. In this passage of Scripture, and most of you are familiar with it, listen to what it says one more time. So David said to him, do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the lands of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually. Now what happened here? Well, you know, David became king of Israel. Probably at that time, the largest and strongest kingdom in all of the world. The one time in all of human history when Israel was exalted to number 1 in the world. And who was the king? The greatest king of all. They had just gotten rid of Saul, who was a disgrace. And David had been anointed king. And the amazing thing to me is that he was anointed king at a young age, and then for the next 15 years, because Saul was so jealous of him, he had to run for his life. Well, as was the custom, when you would take over the kingdom, the one before you had to die, and Saul, of course, died. God put him to death, really. And you would usually also kill all of the heirs. There was a young man that was killed. One of Saul's sons. His name was Jonathan. You remember Jonathan? David loved Jonathan. Jonathan was the kind of friend we all wish we were, or more than that, that we all wish we had. The one who makes a mark on your life and will never be replaced. That was Jonathan. And as he's walking around in the palace one day, his mind goes back to Jonathan. And he starts to think of how wonderful it was and how terrible it was that Jonathan had to die. And so he calls in a servant, and he claps his hands, and the servant comes in and says, yes, master, what is it? He says, are there any of the sons of Jonathan still alive? And the servant says, I'm not sure, but the head of the household for Jonathan is still alive. His name is Ziba, Z-I-B-A. And David says, go call for him, and Ziba comes in with the servant, and he says, are there any of the children of Jonathan still alive? And he said, of course, afraid to answer because he knew that he probably wanted to make sure there were no heirs and have him killed. But no, he reluctantly says, yes, master, there's one. When the raiders came, all of the children ran, and one of the servant women grabbed a little 5-year-old boy and started to run with him, but she was so terrified that she stumbled and dropped the little boy and broke and mangled both of his feet. He's never been able to walk. His name is Mephibosheth. You remember him, don't you? David said, go and get him. Now, I don't know how he felt. How would you think that the reigning king, realizing that you're a live heir, if anything happens to him, Ziba comes in and he brings with him, of course, Mephibosheth. They stand before him, and I just can't imagine, but probably this little boy who has never walked, if he's on some kind of a stretcher or however he is being brought in, I think that the Lord saw that he was terrified. And so he looks at him and he says these words, don't be afraid, I'm here to show you kindness. I'm here to let you eat at my table. I'm here to restore all the lands of your grandfather. I'm going to make you a rich man, and you're going to eat with me at my table for the rest of my life. And probably a curious look comes across the face of Mephibosheth, and he wonders, why are you doing this? And David quickly answers and says, for Jonathan, your father's sake. You know, I think that I look at Jonathan and I think, I'd like to be that kind of a friend, but I'd like to be that kind of a father. The kind that leaves a good name. Where you work, if they bring up your name, what do people say about you? If there was ever a Christian, that's him. If there was ever a person that's not self-serving, that's it. If there was ever a person that would put you first in front of their own needs, that's him. Or would they say, boy, the mouth on that guy. And I know when he's coming, I'm going to hear the latest rank, dirty joke. If there was ever someone I hate to get a beer with after work, it's him, because he hits on every waitress in the place. I've heard all of those things, more of the second than the first. But Jonathan was the first. When you said his name, all that came to the heart of David was an unquenchable love for one of the greatest men that he had ever known. Why is Mephibosheth suddenly being exalted in the kingdom? Not because he did anything great, not because he feels sorry for him as a cripple. It's because Jonathan had such a great name for God. A great father, a great Christian father, is someone who has a great name. I remember buying my first car. We weren't wealthy by any means. It cost me $125. It was a 1954 Ford two-door sedan. It had no quarter panels and no rocker panels. Totally rusted out. And you could drive it down the highway and you knew you were in the right lane because you could watch the yellow stripe and the white stripe run underneath the car. I paid $125 of hard-earned money, and I had everything except the last $50. Dad suggested that I go and see if the bank would give me a loan because he didn't have it. I walked in my teenage gear at the time, and I asked to see someone about a loan, and they looked at me and they said, son, we don't give loans to teenagers. That's exactly what they said. And the man who was talking to me about the loan was very kind, and I said, okay, and I started to walk away, and he said, what's your name? I said, it's Jim Rackham. He said, is Jim Rackham your dad? And I said, yes, he is. He said, you know, he's a great guy. Come on in here. How about $5 a month? Could you handle that? I said, yes, sir, I sure could. And he gave me a loan as a teenager because, of course, Dad co-signed it. But the only reason he actually talked to me was because my dad was a good Christian man. I want to tell you one more. I've got several, but just one more. Can I? I know I've been preaching too long here lately, but it's been so long and I've got so much steam saved up. Jesus is on the Mount of Transfiguration. You remember that? And there's Moses and Elijah, and Jesus appears in his glorified form, and he comes down from the mountain, and we are so fixed on that mountain scene that we almost miss the story that comes next. Because as Jesus descends the mountain, there's a huge crowd of believers at the bottom. And there's a commotion going on. And because of that commotion, there's a child there who either has some disease. In that day, they identified everything as demon possession, and he was having a terrible spasm and writhing around on the ground. I wrote this down. Listen to what happened then. And one of the multitude answered and said, Master, this is the father, I have brought unto thee my son, which has a dumb spirit. Now listen to what he says very carefully. If you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. That gigantic word is the U-S word, us. The father of this son, who had such a terrible thing happening to him, didn't say, have compassion on him. If you can do anything, help him. But the scripture's careful to record that he said, help us. Have compassion on us. There's a father. Anyone that goes through a traumatic situation with a child, the social workers are instructed to get the parents to the side and talk to them. And this is common procedure. When Jamie had her accident, they took us out in the hallway at Wesley. They set us on a bench in front of a window, and they said, she'll never be Jamie again. Jamie is gone. We can put her in a home, and it would probably be best. Your doctor at the time, I remember him saying this, your doctor has called us, and he even said, it's too bad she didn't die. Here's what's going to happen if you try to take her home. She'll last for years. One of you will be up all night, the other will be there all day. You'll never go anyplace together for as long as she lives, and she could live longer than you. But what generally happens is the father will leave. And if the father doesn't, the mother does. Too much angst, too much responsibility. I think that any Christian father digs in his feet and says, this is us. This is my wife and I. This is our child. We're going to pray and ask God to have compassion on us. We're going to do this together. Now, why is it so uncommon? I'm not sure. Why is it that when there is a true need that requires sacrifice, one of the marriage partners decides it's time to go? I wasn't going to say this, but I'm going to. I'm tired. I am weary as a preacher. One thing, if I ever retire, one thing I'm looking forward to is not having to try to figure out a way to look at someone's marriage and say, oh, you ought to get a divorce. I can't do that. But I find myself, just like every preacher, trying to figure out a way to justify this situation. Here is the truth from the lips of Jesus. You have heard that it has been said that you can give the woman a writ of divorcement, which meant simply that you could write on the paper, she's free to marry another man. When you do, Jesus said, you cause her to commit adultery, because a woman couldn't survive without a husband. From the beginning you have heard this, but it is not so. If you're old enough to get married, and if you're strong enough to say, I do, and I guess it's Father's Day, so I'm saying this to fathers. I don't care if she's bigger than she used to be. You probably are too. I don't care whether you find each other as interesting as some magazine article says you ought to, or you don't feel deeply in love like you used to. I ought to be honest enough to tell you that from now on, whether you like it or not, you and your wife, or you and your husband and your children, that's us. There is no escape hatch. From the beginning, you've heard this, but it's not so. It's never God's will, no matter what a preacher has told you. Oh, I think there's reasons to leave. Certainly not to have abuse, physical or verbal or whatever, but when it comes to divorce and remarriage, I think you have to study the Bible for a long time. But I'm speaking to men today when I say to you, man up, Christian up. Quit looking for a way out. Quit looking at your children as though there's someone that are taking away from you money you could spend on yourself. Quit being selfish. As a man, as a Christian man, I expect from you, God expects from you. This is us. One of my favorite stories is about a little boy. I don't know if it's true or not, but it doesn't matter because it's a great story. And his dad was a pastor, a city pastor, a very busy pastor. And the little boy became ill. And he was facing a serious operation, and his dad said, don't worry, I'll be there with you, and I'll come and see you every day. I don't want to do it, he said. Oh, honey, it's going to be all right. I don't want to do it. I'll do it, he said, on one condition, if you're with me. He said, I'll be there during the operation. I'll see you every day till you come back home. He said, no, I want you with me. He thought, well, I'm busy. He said, no, I want you here. And he thought, I do things for other families. I do things for their children. I could do this for him. And so he decided. He went in with him and he promised him, I'll be with you the whole time. He came out of surgery, and in the recovery room, his dad sat there holding his hand, and he looked up at him and opened his eyes one time and just smiled squeezed his finger, and went back to sleep. Finally, a few hours later, he opened his eyes again, and he was finally pretty much awake. And he reached for his dad, and his dad came down and let him hug his neck. He said, "Dad, this is the best day of my life." He said, "Son, surely you don't mean that. You've just come through a very serious operation." And he said, "Yes, but you were here all the time." May I say to you today, dear dads, if you're a Christian dad, I love you. I'm praying for you. But you be there. It's not you. It's not your wants. It's not your needs. It's you and your wife. And if you have children, it's you and your wife and your children. And ask God to have compassion on us. Help us as we stand and sing.